We are continuing the story from 2 Samuel in the Old Testament that Helen began to read just a few minutes ago. And it strikes me that this whole story isn't really a story that you would normally just get up and broadcast to everybody, is it? This story seems to me that is one you might kind of tell somebody sitting by their side with your hand held over your mouth a little bit like this. If we weren't in the midst of a pandemic and worried about that, I might invite all of us to huddle together closer to the center of the room, because we have a story to share, I think, that you just not necessarily want everybody to know that it's a story that's in the Bible. But we continue now, chapter 11, beginning in verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the front of the hardest fighting and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die." As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, 'Why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why'd you go so near the wall?' Then you shall say, 'Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too.'" So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. And the messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of your king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Joab, 'Do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him.'" When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And now, turning to the New Testament, we turn to Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verses 14 through 27. "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that, according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I know that many of you recognize the name Eugene Peterson. He's the author of the biblical translation that is so well loved, and I know many of you still use today, the translation called The Message. Well, Eugene Peterson died a few years ago, and by all accounts, he was just simply a wonderful human being, kind, gentle, humble, quiet of spirit. Many people who knew him as a friend practically considered him to be a saint. He was just adored, and he received much acclaim throughout his career, which so often just embarrassed him whenever he'd hear about it and try and get people not to bring that up. Well, as is the case with important people in religious history, and Eugene Peterson, certainly one of the important figures of the last 50 years, an authorized biography has just been published about Eugene Peterson's life. And the author of the biography is Win Collier, a friend of Peterson's. And since it was an authorized biography, he had access to Eugene Peterson's journals and letters and conversations with his family. He started the biography while Eugene Peterson was still alive, but he finished it just recently after Eugene Peterson's death. And in a recent review of the biography written by a woman named Julia Land Gray, who was also a friend of Eugene Peterson's and taught with him in Canada for many years, she writes with glowing approval of the way that Win Collier sought to explore some of the interior motives of Eugene Peterson's life, the decisions that shaped him, the paths that he chose, and how his own unique personality kind of interacted with those decisions and those paths. But since she knew Eugene Peterson well herself, she also writes in a review that there are parts in the biography that were published that she knows would just make Eugene Peterson shake his head and go silent and want to say, "You can't print that." And even though Win Collier had authorized access to Peterson's journals and letters and other things, Julia Gray feels like there are just some things that should not have been included in the biography. And some of the things she cites are comments that Eugene Peterson made about certain members in his congregation. He served a Presbyterian congregation in Maryland for almost 30 years. And sometime in his journal, he wrote some things about how frustrating and annoying some of the people of that congregation could have been at different times. But she knows that he would have just been aghast if those brief comments had ever come into the public frame, if they had ever been published. And she says they shouldn't have been in the biography. And there are other comments about his marriage to his beloved wife, Jan. They were married for 60 years. But sometimes in the journal, he wrote some things about the difficulties and challenges of being married for that long, some things about their private lives. And Julia Gay says, you know, this is the kind of thing just doesn't need to be in the biography. It would have just made Eugene Peterson want to crawl under a rock and never come out if those things had ever been revealed publicly while he was alive. Would it make you nervous to have somebody write an authorized biography of your life with access to everything that you had written or put on a social media post at some point? It kind of raises the question in my mind of why did they decide to include this story of David and Bathsheba in the Bible in the first place? What was the editor thinking? What was the author thinking? David is revered and remembered as the greatest king in Israel's history. Over the course of the summer, we've been reading some of the wonderful stories about David, and our attention has been drawn to what the important place he has in the life of the people of Israel. And if that's the case, why suddenly did somebody let this story in that just sort of leaves a stain on David's legacy? We know from our own experience that you can write history textbooks and you can intentionally leave out things that are terrible and indicting. Most of us, I'm sure most all of us gathered here in this room, went through secondary education without ever having pictures of slave beatings or lynchings or race riots like the Tulsa race riot or even the Ocoee race riot ever appearing in any textbooks that we had throughout our secondary education. You can just leave these kind of things out if you choose to. But here in the midst of all these stories that have been building about David's rise, his military victories, his unification of the kingdom of Israel, the embodiment he has of God's divine approval, here at the pinnacle of David's power, suddenly the story just simply falls off the edge and seems to descend in a calculated plot that includes rape, adultery, deceit, murder, and simple moral callousness. Why in the world did they put this story of David and Bathsheba in the Bible? And what does it mean to us? As it's likely a story that we've heard somewhere along the line and have carried with us in our memories. Maybe it's a cautionary tale. Look at what happens when someone becomes too powerful. Perhaps it's an example of Lord Acton's famous saying, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The very first line in the story it invites us to think and to realize that something's suddenly off kilter. In the spring of the year, when the time is that kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites. They besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. You might remember, if you go back a number of chapters all the way back into the first book of Samuel, you might remember that when the people demanded a king, they said they wanted a king to be like other nations. They said they wanted a king specifically who would go out before us and fight our battles. The experience of Israel with their kings proves time and time again to be much less than they expected, just as God said would be the case. On his way up the ladder, David is always described as valiant and courageous, a warrior leading the armies of Israel out to do battle. But now when he's at the top of his game, David decides to send his general Joab out to do the fighting while he chills in Jerusalem. I would think that in some ways that's a prime example of great power, to be able to have capable lieutenants around you that you could just send out to do all the work for you. But as this story starts to unfold, David's decision to remain in Jerusalem sets the stage for a coming failure, which will be great. His decision, when the story simply says, David remained in Jerusalem, is a prelude to the trouble that is to follow. It's as though David's choice to exercise his power to stay home and to send others out to do the fighting initiates a kind of downward spiral and misuse of power. David remained at home, and then the story tells us it happened. It just so happened. While he was chilling there in Jerusalem and enjoying the view from his palace rooftop one afternoon, it just so happened that he saw Bathsheba bathing. And now David's power as king becomes simply the instrument of his own personal desire. David sends an aide to get information on Bathsheba. Notice who's doing everything. David sends an aide to get the scuttlebutt on who this woman is. And when he learns that she's Uriah's wife, David sends messengers to get her. David gets and David takes what David wants, what he desires. Now, while the details of these actions are direct and maybe even a little sparse, it's clear if you read through it that all of the agency, at least as described by the narrator, all of the agency, all of the power at this point, it's David's. This is not a case of Bathsheba tempting or trapping David. This is not a story of passionate romance between two lonely people. The history of much biblical interpretation of this story has tried to make Bathsheba at least equally, if not entirely, responsible for what happened. The portrayal of this story by Hollywood has tried to make it a consensual love affair. But neither could be further from the truth. David exercised his power over a vulnerable individual to get what he wanted. As one commentator puts it, this is coercive, self-indulgent use of power to satisfy sexual lust on David's part. End of story. And as another commentator put it, the contrast between David's agency and power in this story, contrasted with Bathsheba's powerlessness and lack of voice, almost makes her a complete non-person, just simply a part of the plot. The limits to David's power, though, start to emerge in what happens next. David's power is exercised. He sees and he sins and he gets and he takes what he wants. Then Bathsheba conceives and she sends David a message, "I'm pregnant." And the story is suddenly moved forward now by something that seems to be a little bit beyond David's control. David's use of his power has consequences. And now David deals with the consequences by simply indulging in a further pattern of misuse of his power. David puts a scheme into place to bring Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, back from battle and to try and get him caught in a charade set up by David that will make it appear as though Uriah is in fact the father of the child. David tells Uriah, "Go spend the night at home with your wife." But David can't control Uriah's sense of loyalty to the troops in the field. And Uriah chooses to sleep with the servants at David's house. It's ironic, isn't it? The king's power, which is unlimited in his view, the king's power is thwarted by the loyalty of the person he's trying to manipulate. So next, David tries to get Uriah drunk and go home and be with Bathsheba. But Uriah still doesn't fall into David's trap. So unable to trick Uriah into a lie about Bathsheba's pregnancy, David plots to have Uriah murdered, sending him out into the front lines of battle while secretly telling his general Joab to pull back from the rest of the troops, leaving Uriah to be struck down by the enemy and die. And when Joab, following strictly David's orders, sends back a messenger to David with news of Uriah's death, which seems to indicate Joab may have certainly understood all along what was going to happen. He anticipates David's anger at the loss of the other Israelite soldiers in the maneuver to kill Uriah, and he carefully sends a message that essentially pins David down with the word of David's fiat accompli. Just tell the king, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too. And David's response to the news of Uriah's death is callous and cold. He assumes that his power to maneuver and manipulate people and events has removed any difficulty his actions may have created and restored his control over events. And so David sends back an order to Joab, don't let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on this city and overthrow it. Encourage my general Joab. It seems to me that if the story ended here, we might say David's power is only limited by his ability to manipulate the situation for his own purposes. It seems like David is desperately trying to get out one step in front of the things that have happened and control and do damage control to the consequences that his own power has already created. His power only seems to be limited by these unanticipated consequences. But even then, the limits seem somewhat temporary. They're limited until David uses his power to craft a way around the consequences he faces. So that at the end of the story, at least where it seems to have concluded at the end of the chapter, it says simply, David has Bathsheba and a new son in his house. The story, it seems to me, of David and Bathsheba depicts David as a king who thinks and acts like his power is unlimited. And so it falls in line with the warning that the king gave the people of Israel when they first asked for a king. A king, God said, will take your sons and daughters and use them for his own ends. He will take your sons to build a large army and to tend his own field. The king, God says, will take your daughters and make them perfumers and cooks and bakers. A king, God said, will take everything you've got and make it your own, and he will make you his slaves. Nevertheless, they yelled, give us a king. And David once again proves the truth of God's view of the king. Perhaps the story of David and Bathsheba is in the Bible to warn us about the dangers of too much power entrusted to one person, especially leaders. When Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, you know who he was especially talking about? He was talking about popes and kings. It's hard not to open the newspaper nowadays or turn on the radio or look at the computer screen and not see some story of where power seems to have corrupted someone and great power seems to have corrupted someone even to greater effect, and institutions seem to start to fall apart. I recently started to listen to a podcast sponsored by the magazine Christianity Today called Who Killed Mars Hill? And if you haven't heard of Mars Hill before, Mars Hill was a huge megachurch out, I believe, in the state of Washington, led by a pastor named Mark Driscoll. And the history of that church was entirely focused on Driscoll's charisma, Driscoll's energy, Driscoll's forcefulness, Driscoll's power. And it all came falling down when it was revealed that charisma, that forcefulness, that energy, that power simply devolved into abuse and desire and self-acclaim. You and I, we have plenty around us in the world today to remind us of what this story seems to remind us of. That there are limits to power. And we should be very careful about entrusting power, allowing power to captivate us, even as we pass it on to someone simply because they're a celebrity, to someone simply because they're already in power, to someone simply because they're saying what we want to hear them say. The story seems to warn us about power and its limits, to caution us. We know this, don't we? We come up against it, and it seems to present great challenges to us. We can do so many things, but we can't seem to find a collective will to deal with what all that we can do is in effect doing to the world around us, simply in terms, or maybe primarily in terms even of climate change. We have the technology and the science to quickly develop a vaccine to help protect us from a very deadly virus, but we can't seem to garner the power or the consensus to all come together around using the vaccine to protect people. We have this great ability and technology to communicate instantly online with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. But we haven't figured out how to guide and determine what kind of speech, what kind of information is really helpful and good to share across that medium. And forgetting these limits of power, we learn again and again, as the story of David and Bathsheba seems to tell us, forgetting these limits of power leads to suffering, leads to hardship, leads to tragedy, leads to injustice. So maybe this story is here to warn us. Be careful with power when it's yours, when you give it to others. Don't forget the limits, even if it's simply the limit of having to deal with the consequences your power creates. But then the story moves in an entirely different direction in that last verse which we read, with the word, the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And suddenly we're on the precipice of this story being a reminder to the people of Israel that David isn't the primary actor or power at work shaping their story, but God is. And perhaps this story can become for us an invitation to begin to seek to discern and ponder and seek the presence of God's power at work in our lives and in the world around us today. What are the ways God is moving that empower us, not simply to exercise power, but to be the people that God empowers us to be? What are the signs around us in our lives? What are the opportunities that we have, not simply to exercise power, but to be open to the power of Christ working through us? There's a story in John's Gospel where Jesus feeds the great multitudes, similar to the other synoptic stories of the great feedings. But in John's Gospel, when the people are fed, then they start to chase Jesus around the lake because they want to continue to get more bread and more fish to eat. And when they chase him around the lake and come up against Jesus again, Jesus says, "You've just come now to see signs again. You have just come now to see wonders and power at work. You've just come now to take your fill." And the people gathered together, and Jesus discerns that what they want is to take and make him king. And the Gospel of John says Jesus withdraws. Jesus moves away from that kind of grasping power. Where are we invited with Jesus to move away from the way power grasps at so much in the world around us today? Where are we invited to hear the words of Paul and remember the power of God, which comprehends everything, which is the height and the depth and the length of all creation? Where are we invited and called to be opened to that power as we experience it through the fullness of Jesus' love in our life? You have a responsibility to exercise power. You have a responsibility, a calling, to let Christ's power work through you. Amen.